The word underrated is a bit of a tricky one. By definition, for something to be underrated, a lot of people have to disagree that it's underrated. If everyone agrees that something is underrated, it's not underrated anymore because no one is rating it as lower than it should be, you know? Underappreciated though, now that's a different story. Is it possible for something like Ori and the Will of the Wisps, a game that has sky-high review scores, was nominated for multiple awards at the biggest games award show in the world, and has a version that tied for second best game review score of 2020 on Metacritic, to be underappreciated? I'd say yes, not because it didn't get the acclaim it deserved on release, but because it isn't treated as if it set a new bar for one of the oldest video game genres in existence, which it absolutely did. And in fact, it's not talked about much at all. The way it's treated, you'd have half a mind to think that this game came out years ago. Nah dude, this released in 2020. By the time the Game Awards rolled around last year, the impact that this game had felt like it had almost entirely dissipated, which is reflected pretty well by the awards themselves. It wasn't in the running for Game of the Year, which, okay, personally I'd put it above some of these titles, but I get it, this is gonna be more AAA dominant, and Hades snuck in there because it was one of the most celebrated games in years. But okay, it's not nominated for direction, alright, I guess maybe it was easier to nominate games that have more overt storytelling. It's not nominated for best narrative either, despite being one of the most effective stories that I've ever seen told with almost no words. Okay, that's fine, I guess. Nominated for music, but no win. I can understand that considering the competition. And then no nomination for best indie game. Why? What? How? Okay, who let this happen? I thought maybe it didn't qualify because they have some exclusivity with Microsoft, so that big publisher might make them considered not an indie for the Game Awards, but nope, Fall Guys is there, and Moon Studios' website calls them an independent studio, so somebody explain this to me? This shouldn't be happening. I'm holding on to hope that there is some catch that I'm not aware of that kept it from being in this category, but if not, this is straight up highway robbery. To not get nominated at all, I would still give Hades the win, but a nomination at least. And as much as I love Ghost of Tsushima and it does have some amazing art design, the game looks beautiful and full of life and color, but dude, look at this. This is, in my opinion, by far the best implementation of 3D models being placed into a 2D setting. Everything has so much texture, the way the colors work together, it makes it possible to go from some of the most dire and dangerous looking settings you'll find in a game to a beautiful underwater landscape not a second later. Every character has so much detail and looks so unique. The striking difference between your character and the backdrop, I feel like Kanye West right now. Ghost of Tsushima is beautiful, but Ori and the Will of the Wisps has one of the greatest art designs of all time. It's not just a matter of the Game Awards, however. I feel like Ori doesn't get the credit it deserves for creating what is, in my opinion, mechanically the best Metroidvania ever made. This is a very popular genre that indie devs are adding to constantly, and it's produced some of the most beloved titles of all time. It's got insane quality, it's got mass quantity, so I seriously don't say this lightly. Probably the game that'll make most people go, whoa, wait a sec, you gotta relax here, buddy, at least if we're talking about Metroidvanias, not actual Metroid or Castlevania games, is Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight took basically every single good part of the Metroidvania genre and injected it with straight heroin. The world was beautiful and had a deep sadness to it, interspersed with charm and levity. Exploration was finely tuned, secrets were around throughout the entire map, and the game would let you stumble around these uninviting environments for a while before giving you the tools to chart your path. And the combat, oh my god, such a simple approach is taken, but the enemies, especially the bosses, are designed so well around the straightforward systems that the game is able to give us multiple solid candidates for the top 20 bosses of the decade. But is Hollow Knight really a better game than Ori? Yes, yeah, it sort of is. As a game, especially if we look at just how much content is present in Hollow Knight, it's hard to give the edge to Ori for me personally. And I mean, Hollow Knight is one of the greatest games of all time, so that's not a diss by any means. But I genuinely believe that Ori is mechanically superior to this game and any other Metroidvania game, and it has some major strengths over Hollow Knight that make this gap a lot smaller than you might think. To me, Hollow Knight's actual basic makeup is pretty standard fare. The jumping in this game is hard to get used to at first because it's got a bit of airiness to it. The combat, like I said, isn't horribly complex. You can hit in a few directions, you have a few special attacks that are given to you at very long intervals and you need to explore to find them, and then you have spells which don't get much more complex than big damage cone in some direction. A lot of this game's base is nothing special at all. The thing is, Team Cherry ringed out basically every drop of quality and content you could get out of that base. The core parts of this game's platforming are not remarkable, but the platforming sections really are. The combat is simple, the bosses are anything but. Ori however, has deep, rich, and buttery smooth systems that it uses exceptionally well. And although certain elements like its boss fight design maybe aren't up to snuff with its competition, other game elements it absolutely blows that competition out of the water, starting with its movement. I don't think there's a game in existence that has a better 2D movement system or more fluid platforming than Ori. I'll hear people out if they want to say maybe Celeste, but for my money, nothing tops Ori. Even just running and jumping in this game is satisfying and feels like you're controlling a pillow that's filled with a cloud. Ori stretches and compresses in such a perfect way that you can take these massive bounds into the air and it looks graceful as all hell, but then you also land in a way that looks like it perfectly distributes the force and you end up feeling no impact at all. Ori is this being made out of light, and accordingly you feel almost massless on your dismount, despite the game also making sure your jump itself isn't floaty and has a satisfying arc. In a Metroidvania, especially one that emphasizes platforming, the fact that the mere act of jumping and landing feels so good is one of the most important parts of the game, and Ori does it beautifully. The focus on making this character feel as agile as possible is even more of a godsend during tougher platforming sections. Your character feels like a proper extension of yourself with some added visual flair. This is me changing directions a couple times while jumping in Hollow Knight. Nothing wrong, pretty standard, can't be mad at it. But this is me doing the exact same thing in Ori. The character kicks off backwards so seamlessly to turn on a dime, and then once I press the jump button again and change directions, I go into an aerial somersault. Now slowed down, you can see that there's a weird change in rotation that doesn't feel natural when you scrutinize it, but in game, in real time, it feels perfect. You cannot do any better than this. The game gives you all of the character freedom that you'd have if you were straight up just controlling an orb of light, but it sets up a full character with a complicated and cleverly designed set of animations that make that movement look and feel really cool. Then comes the topic of the abilities you gain during your playthrough, which are some of the most fun Metroidvania abilities I've ever experienced. Because movement is the game's bread and butter, your abilities have you swimming through underwater sections, shooting out of that water at high velocity, grappling onto distant points, attaching yourself to grass or walls or rooftops, using airborne enemies or projectiles or dangling items to shoot yourself upwards, typically a couple times in a row, diving headlong into sand where you burrow at intense speeds and shoot out the end. Every single one of these is a miniature showcase of Ori's animation, and stringing these together like you often have to is some of the best, most satisfying gameplay on the face of the earth. At a certain point near the end, you feel like you don't ever want to stop moving. After you just chained every ability together in the most harmonious and fluid possible way and you finally land on solid flat ground, you just want to keep going. Full steam ahead, sprint through this area and see how long you can go without experiencing any kind of hitch. It's almost Sonic-esque in how it makes you want to just move, but its strength is in its grace rather than speed. Every motion leads to the next. During escape scenes from giant beasts, which is another massive upside this game brings to the table by the way, as things fall away sometimes to perfectly grant you access to a ledge or grapple point at the last second, you feel like you're doing one of those drawings where the person never lifts the pencil from the page. It's all one giant motion. Playing Ori makes me feel so cool because either I'm jumping perfectly through the intricate hoops, or I'm messing everything up, but still somehow it looks kinda sexy. The game knows this about itself too, so it puts you in a lot of scenarios where you're always moving, including the really fun race-style challenges throughout the map. They're optional, but they give you a reward, and I don't know why you'd ever skip them because they're hands down some of the most enjoyable parts of the game. While Ori doesn't possess the same level of enemy design and boss fights that some of its contemporaries have, the actual combat is more fleshed out than most Metroidvanias. The second game ditched the bland, repetitive, and button-mashy combat of the first game that felt a little tacked on to be honest, and equipped Ori 2 with a proper melee weapon, fun combat animations that work beautifully with your high-flying antics, and a bevy of abilities and spirit weapons that are pretty diverse and fun to play around with. They can be used for ranged attacks or crowd control or high damage output to name a few, and while I did just go on record saying that the enemies in this game aren't A1, they're not bad by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of fights, especially the combat challenges, are a really good time. There's nothing super standout about what you're facing, but you'll almost definitely have a good time with the more action-focused sections of the game. Because the actual chemical buildup of the action system is better than really any Metroidvania that I've played. I guess what I'm saying is, when Ori 2 released last year, it sort of raised the bar of some of the Metroidvania genre's most crucial elements to infinity. And yet, it feels less like a landmark title that we'll look back on for decades and compare every subsequent game in the genre to, and instead is just treated like a really great game. Maybe it's because it's a sequel. The first game did so many of the same things right, but it was missing a good combat system and had yet to fully expand on the potential of the game's movement system. And so when the second game did those things, it didn't feel as monumental because we'd seen a lot of its most groundbreaking achievements already. I don't know if that's the exact reason, but no matter what, I think it's a damn shame that Ori and the Will of the Wisps already feels like it's in the back of people's minds. It's got a devoted fan base, but I really don't don't think we talk about it as much as we should. Despite this though, I think this is too good of a game to not persevere in some way. And I think in 5-10 years when we discuss the greatest Metroidvanias or hell, the greatest indie games ever made, Ori might just be called that one word that should be basically impossible for a game with a 93 on Metacritic. Underappreciated.